Is climate change a threat to Lesotho or to the African continent at large? This is a question I believe has been left unanswered for many a year. In today's conversation, I get to chat to a climate change enthusiast, and for the life of me, I never actually thought we would ever talk about climate change because I never thought it would affect me. So in today's conversation, we're going to unpack how climate change plays an important role, and more specifically, what we should know as young people in the Lesotho context about climate change. So in today's conversation, like I mentioned, I get to chat to a climate change enthusiast. So for people who don't know you, who are you?
Thanks for having me on your podcast. Really, thank you. I'm Kwaile Monaheng. I'm from the Kingdom of Lesotho. I call myself an African storyteller, a climate change scholar. So I really talk about, amplifying the African voice when it comes down to climate change. So that's how I literally describe myself.
Nice.
Yeah.
I love the storyteller part. So maybe talk us through climate change is such a weird space, especially for the ordinary Mosotho. What got you interested in this space?
Wow. I think, it's actually weird because there's a taboo around climate change that it's not ours to own as Africans, that there's this idea of a changing environment so foreign from who we are. But climate change is actually so important to Lesotho's DNA, to you and me, to the people who came before us, our forefathers, Mushweshwe era. If we think about how the Lesotho calendar works, Selemo sa Basotho, the months. Have you noticed that those months actually instructions on how to till the land, on how to manage the land? There's a spiritual connection between nature and climate there.
Yeah.
And that's like, if you think about forecasting, if you think about preparation for food, that's what our forefathers did. So they respected the environment. They had a lot to do with the environment had a lot to do with how they functioned as human beings and how the Basotho nation came together. So climate change is there, the changing environment. So this is something that's quite important for us. If you think about indigenous knowledge, the spiral, there's a reading that some people in Lesotho right now are able to do that forecasts the weather.
Wow, okay, I did not know that.
You didn't know that?
I did not know that.
That is literally in our DNA. If you think maybe more symbolic in our history, when Mushweshwe moved closer inland in southern Africa, if it wasn't for that environment, if it wasn't for how the topography of Tababusiu, where do you think Lesotho would have been? Because that's how we won our wars as well. So the environment and nature is really spiritual to how we are as people, but more the spiritual, nature of the land to us as Basotho, but also in Africa. So climate change, the environment, it's all intertwined. So we've basically been doing this for a very long time, yeah.
So now suddenly you know all of this, and then you decide to go all the way to do your master's. How's that going, firstly? And then, what are you unpacking or what are you learning from your master's journey?
It's actually weird because I didn't start with climate change. So this is, I suppose, knowledge that I acquired in the last 2 to 3 years. But let me just bit on my education. I was at prep. After prep, I was at Machaweng. After Machaweng, I wanted to do art. I'm really creative at heart.
Wow, I love creatives.
Folks are like, no, not at my house. Sorry, find something else. And then, I had mentors, role models that were in diplomacy and international relations. So that's what I naturally chose when I went to Rhodes University, which is ironically also a very creative university.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I did an undergrad in economics, international relations, and politics at Rhodes. And then, I ventured on and on and on. Then I realized, I think it was in a seminar given by a scholar who was in the industry working for government on climate change. And in these seminars, people come in, scholars come in, industry people come in, and, I was just struck by how climate change is affecting Africa. So I decided to venture into my master's to do a master's in climate change, international relations, intertwine the two, but for Africa. So from the African perspective, global governance, how do we manage climate change? And how does Africa amplify its voice in climate change? Because ironically, the developed world is historically responsible for these carbon emissions, and we'll go into that a bit later. But we are most affected as Africa, so we definitely have an incentive to participate in these negotiations. So after that, then I moved to UCT at a master's level. So I literally jumped out of a plane and stitched the parachute down.
Wow. Okay.
Because at Rhodes, I'd already done all of these things. I built myself, and I just realized that I just was lacking in terms of the scientific knowledge of climate change. Because if you think about international relations, I was thinking about how African leaders are outmaneuvered at the global level when it comes to understanding of climate change, the technical aspects especially. And then we end up signing deals that we don't really know the extent of. The people who capacitate us are from Europe and the developed world. So you really think about what's the African position? How do we guard ourselves against them? And how do we negotiate from the subordinate level? So all of those things started coming out. And then luckily for me, I got I don't want to say luckily, I worked for it. But I am a Mandela Rhodes alumni. So I got the Mandela Rhodes. And that's literally one of Africa's most prestigious scholarships, perhaps even the world.
Yeah, congratulations on that, actually.
Thank you. But I'm an alumni now, so yeah,
same story. Yeah.
And luckily for me, luck is for people who don't think winning happens by accident. So let me stop there. It wasn't luck. I really worked for it, and I was able to then go to UCT, where we have the African Climate Development Initiative, and that's literally like a fast tracking at a master's level with climate change and sustainable development. And I think I got the biggest shock because I'm a humanities student. And when we were registering, I got the shock of my life when I was told, bro, you're actually in the science faculty.
Whoa.
My whole inner Dexter's lab sort of started coming out, and I'm like, I've actually been this guy. Like growing up, I've actually been the Carlton of the group. Please don't say I look like Carlton. I'm not going to do the dance.
No
but
comment.
like people sort of want to say, you look like Carlton, this is your vibe, you're a square. And I vouch for squares, Maggie. I think that's literally, being a square is actually so cool.
Yeah.
But like growing up in uni or like growing up maybe in high school, I was the square. I was, So it's actually kind of like who's kind of laughing now type of thing. But
Wow.
I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
So I'm interested to find out, with all of what you just said now, there's an ordinary Mosotho who is listening to our conversation. How does climate change affect them at an individual level? How does it affect Lesotho as a country? And you mentioned that African leaders are signing deals that they don't necessarily understand. What should we be thinking about when it comes to climate change as a continent, as a country, and as an individual?
Okay, so I think let me do bottom up because, most of information is top down. So let me actually reverse that, which is what we're actually trying to do with knowledge anyway. For the ordinary Mosotho, we're thinking about how we're already vulnerable in terms of, where we live, in terms of, the poverty line. And if you think of farmers, if you think of climate risks, impacts, floods, droughts, they don't really affect us here that much in the urban sector. But you have to think about how sub-Saharan Africa depends on rain-fed agriculture to live. So droughts being more frequent, all of those things really cause a multiplicity or a multiplier effect, where if there's drought, that affects crop failure, which leads to food insecurity. We're already below the poverty line. All of those things. Climate change is, projected to warm. Well, Southern Africa is projected to warm twice at the global rate. We're in Southern Africa. So you need to think about how all those things affect livelihoods directly, food insecurity, and, development entirely, because this is what we depend on. So then you open it up and you realize that, hang on, Lesotho isn't the only country affected by this. We don't exist in a vacuum. Other African countries also depend to a large extent on agriculture, which means climate change also affects them. And, again, as I mentioned before, we're not responsible for these things. We might have the least emissions as a continent, but we're the most affected because we can't adapt.
Sure.
We don't have the cushions that the developed world has to adapt to climate change. So our economies are vulnerable. If you think of our development is vulnerable. So for us we're on the front line of climate change. So we have to adapt. I mean, in other countries, like if you think of what's happening in northern Kenya, they've had the worst drought they've had in decades. And for them, it's loss and damage. There's a point where in the climate change conversation, you can't adapt anymore. It becomes loss and damage. It means that thing that you had is gone. So those were the things we were discussing. I suppose I'm moving on to my career here, where I'm actually a consultant in the climate change space. I work in Kenya. And I got the opportunity to go to Egypt this year for COP27. Wow. And, you know, you guys will hear about the loss and damage historic deal. We've been demanding loss and damage. We've been demanding as Africans to exist. We've been demanding to be taken seriously. Our narratives have not been taken seriously. Our lived experience as Africans has not been taken seriously for the last 27 years in these negotiations, for the last few decades. So to get that deal isn't necessarily something it's historic, it's amazing, we're celebrating. But we've been asking for that deal since Rio 1992. So, it's taken a while. What does that mean to negotiate your existence? How are we doing that in 2022? There were other outcomes out of, the climate change negotiations in Egypt that also involved, 1.5. And everybody talks about what does 1.5 do? What's this number, 1.5? 1.5 is basically the number that the IPCC, this is the organizational body full of scientists who are responsible, and they are the authority on climate change. So 1.5 global warming in terms of, greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, then, there's that warming greenhouse gas effect. Basically means that for Africa, that's double. So we're now projected to go to 2.7.
Whoa.
Because nothing was done to curb emissions, which means that fossil fuels, that's something very interesting. Fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, those are old systems of energy that the developed world, developed on. So climate change then becomes a factor because we can't use those same systems. They're old, and that's why it comes down to renewable energy. Because if those systems worked, why do we still have energy poverty in Africa? Why are 600 million Africans still without energy access and electricity if fossil fuels are supposed to guarantee us prosperity? So there's a lot of things around climate change and, for Lesotho, renewable energy. Wow. We're one country and you'll hear about energy transition, and this is where the world is going. We need to secure our energy access, our energy ownership, but at the same time, we're going through climate change. So there's three intersecting crises. There's energy, development, and climate. Sure. That for African countries and the rest of the developing world, we're dealing with these. So there's a lot. There's
a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And I mean, you mentioned that you are consulting. You've been in Kenya. You've been to Ethiopia. I know you're one of the directors in a company. Maybe talk us through what that company does. And literally talk us through what the company does. Khansa Energy.
Yeah. So let me just correct you quickly.
Okay.
I've been since joining this NPO in Kenya, I've been to Tunisia, Egypt, Tanzania, Kenya. Yeah.
Wow.
So there's and then it's actually really funny. I went to Saudi Arabia to get back into Africa when I flew to. It's a weird one. I had to Doha, Qatar.
Sure.
I went
just to get back into
Africa.
To get back to Good
Africa.
Heavens. Good heavens, yeah.
But Khansa Energy is a social enterprise that provides energy access or that co-creates renewable energy solutions through indigenous knowledge. So we were first up in 2018. Mm-hmm. That's when we registered, and it's actually an amazing story because the people who founded Khansa were actually dating at the time when they dropped me off for my first year.
Oh.
That's 9 years ago.
Dating.
Oh, okay. The
one
holiday I needed to go for my first year. They dropped me off on my first day of first year.
Okay.
Literally, they were the ones that are like, peace, bro. I'm like, what do I do? They're like, you enjoy varsity. And 9 years later, we own a company together.
That's nice.
So that's literally like the full circle of trust, the full circle of loyalty, and also growth. Watching me in the space because I first started at Khansa Energy as a consultant, climate change consultant. And I developed a strategy that was built on how do we move beyond electricity? How do we move beyond electricity to think about climate adaptation, to think about resilience, to think about how we use electricity? What does that do for the livelihoods of people who literally depend on light for their everyday chores? Imagine you, TK, you have six hours in the day to be functional.
I need 48.
Exactly. So if we think about what that does back, if we think about there's no industry, if I tell you the stories that we've seen, the narratives that we've seen in the Lesotho Highlands, which is also where we operate, we literally get to see the most amazing stories in the sense that people embrace renewable energy. But there's also this, it's not romanticized. There's this idea that renewable energy will guarantee the leapfrog, we'll use renewable energy, for instance, to develop like that. There's a leapfrog narrative to it. There's this idea that it will be catalytic, just like that will go. But what we really need to realize is that before we implement these solutions, they are disruptive, because if you think about the rural population, there's already existing systems of people. There's already existing systems where this transformation is about to take place. How do you explain to someone that you're offering solar power when they've, for decades, lived on candles and kerosene? So those are the things, communication is very important when you introduce new technology. And at the same time, we're talking about the idea that there's all of these livelihoods. So it's actually an interesting model. We're invited into the community. That's why it's an indigenous, knowledge. Indigenous knowledge leads us. We're invited into the community. We interact with the councillors and the chief. So we attend a proper pizza, where we learn about what the needs of the people are. So it actually goes beyond electrification to having a deeper understanding of people's lives.
And I think I like when you say the deeper understanding and combining that with the communication.
Exactly.
Because many a time, these amazing initiatives go wrong when the communication is not done well.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, our history speaks to, lack in civic participation, lack in inclusion of everyday people. So the Basotho Highlanders, or lots of rural Basotho, have a very, very different perception when you come in to help them, because they have been betrayed numerous times. They've been displaced. So we had to really do the work to build trust, to say, you guys are the experts. You guys are not statistics to be implemented, or you're not statistics to be impacted. You guys, this is your thing. There needs to be ownership,
Yeah.
And then they also then feed back into a model where we realize that it's not enough to ask someone to pay for electricity on a lump sum, because what are the income strands? They have sheep sharing, sikiri. You think about crops as well. So those are the two main income
Sources of income, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we really needed to tailor make our model to move from energy access to ownership, where we actually place the energy directly into the hands of the people, where they're actually paying over months to own this thing. And also paying in conjunction or in parallel with how they earn. So the pay-as-you-go allows them to actually have this option to access energy, but at the same time also think of the other livelihood, impacts that they need to sort of satisfy.
Yeah.
So that's really allowed us to have, I'm proud to say, 100% uptake in our products. So that's really
100% uptake.
100%.
My goodness.
Zero defaults. So that's that. But I think fundamentally it was the communication aspect. It was understanding. It was actually knowing that we're treating people as equals, because people,
they can think
they
for
can
themselves.
think.
They can really think
We
for
can
themselves.
learn a lot.
Yeah.
And actually, when I said beyond electrification, I'm talking about we have 6 pillars: education, climate resilience, energy access, technology. I'm missing a few right now. I think I'm missing 2.
Yeah, about 2.
But I'm saying you actually learn so much more, and there's all of this repository of data that we can use to feed back to the Lesotho government around what does it mean, and how far do we go as a model to help communities, or to help even the government achieve their energy targets,
Yeah.
the electricity targets in the rural community, because there's a deficit right now where we see the urban sector being growing, but the rural sector is not growing as fast as the urban sector. So there's a projected, the World Bank, the World Bank report talks about the fact that there's going to be a deficit up until 2030. So we're not actually going to meet SDG 7.
Sure.
So we're actually helping with that. And I think for me, the fundamental bigger picture is Lesotho doesn't have fossil fuels. So when we talk about the energy transition, I actually think Lesotho can be, and I'm going to say it here, 100% renewable.
100% renewable. Wow.
Imagine if we were able to feed the electricity back into the Southern African power pool and say no to Eskom and say no to Mozambique and phase them out gradually as we become more, there's
a lot to unpack in this topic.
There's a lot.
As you're
One
speaking,
episode's not enough.
I know. I definitely know. So talking about things that, shifting gears slightly, talking about things that you should be proud about, you have just received an award. So maybe talk us through what award you have recently won and the whole process.
Okay.
How you feel, what it entails, what it takes to actually win that award. I won't mention it. You were the guest of honor, so talk us through that. Yeah.
It was a team effort. In fact, I want to say it was a country effort.
What do they usually say? Teamwork. Dreamwork is teamwork. Yes.
100%.
I got it right this time.
So I think, so I'm a Mandela Rhodes scholar. Alumni now. So I entered into, there's different programs under the Mandela Rhodes as scholars, and I was able to, I'm a recipient, I'm a joint winner actually of the 2022 ANIT Prize, which supports initiatives that target the most marginalized communities or the most marginalized vulnerable populations in Africa. So I've given you the context now, so you see how Khansa sort of comes in. But I wouldn't have been able to do this alone. I mean, if I look at my team, Kevin, Dennis, Ritumetse, we were able to come together and think about, how do we come together and how do we use our strengths to bring this, birth this baby? How do we bring Khansa to where it is? Which is, again, quite symbolic, which means to light up. But in this instance, Khansa also means the idea of enlightenment. Yeah. Because we're also conscientizing people on energy access, energy poverty, indigenous knowledge, the idea that Lesotho we get to be ourselves and we get to be very proud of being Basotho in the space that is very renewable energy, indigenous knowledge. Being able to intersect those, because we have a lot to learn from indigenous knowledge all over the world. These indigenous people have been the custodians of sustainable development for a very long time. So, back to the prize. It's going to allow us to do a lot more than we had anticipated starting off. So it's a grant, and it's basically going to allow us to electrify more homes, but also to build a repository of knowledge, but also to set ourselves up for, for more funding, for more a competitive edge. Entering the market with a grant like that really says we've announced ourselves, and that's something that we really want to also keep going at. So that's something that's quite big also for the country, because when you get that international nod from experts all over the world, from experts who are kings and queens in their own right all over the world, we're stretching as far from the US. We're talking about people who are on global panels, who said yes to Khansa, who said yes to Lesotho, who said yes to us. So that already speaks volumes of where we want to go, and 100%. So we're in this space, and beyond just the prize, it's also about the idea of runway and the idea that we want to at least bring Lesotho on the map while we still have this runway before we take off. Bring Lesotho on the map. People are having these conversations around Lesotho. I was at COP27 just now. The Lesotho delegation hosted their own panel. That's I don't think people understand the gravity of that situation. There's also a person in the delegation, Mokona Franz, who is one of Africa's lead negotiators. Why are we not reporting on those things? This is where Lesotho is at, you know? And I think also just to bring it down to young people, to bring it down to conscientizing people about the importance of climate change and where Lesotho stands and where Lesotho stands to gain. Imagine if we became an example for the rest of the world on what it means to be a renewable energy producer, but doing it in the right way as well, because it's not enough for us to replicate the idea of fossil fuels where there's an exclusionary process, there's no civic participation. When we implement renewable energy solutions, sustainable interventions, we also need free, prior and informed consent from those communities before we go in there.
Wow.
That's something very important that we don't think about. Where are these, we talk about, I'll use an example of the distribution. Where are those power lines going to go? That's people's land. We think about solar power, Have you the solar power being built on arable land? What do those communities do now? People being displaced because of major dam projects. Where do those communities go? Even if there was some sort of consultation and they agreed, does that compensation really, does money really compensate you for what you've lost because of the Highlands Water Project, for instance?
Sure.
So, it's not just Lesotho, this is happening all over the world. So as we implement sustainable solutions, we can't replicate systems of exclusion that have already been, grounded on fossil fuels. Then, we're just replicating the same wheel, right? So all of these things come into the aspect. So, there was a big win for Lesotho community, raising awareness. So,
well done.
Yeah.
Well done. So we're definitely out of time for this particular episode because, like we mentioned, there's so much more to do and to cover. And I'm just sitting here thinking, my goodness, I need to do a lot more research in terms of climate change. So in closing, I've got 2 questions and I think we have less than a minute left.
Sure.
The first one is, as Mr. Monaheng, what would you say is your biggest financial blunder? It's a Money Adventures podcast after all. So what would you say? Well, it could be this week. It could be your entire life. It could be whatever. What would you say is your biggest financial blunder?
Okay.
And then the second question is, in fact, it's not a question. What do you say to a young person watching this episode on climate change? What can they do if they want to get into the space that you are in at the moment?
So on the financial side, I think my biggest blunder has been the lack of planning. As a young person, you don't plan for your own personal finances. You're stuck there thinking, where did my money go? So I think that, and I also, the work that you do also educates people on that. So kudos for that as well, So I think for young people, having that financial planning, that personal budgeting, that's something very important. I've been more savvy now, understanding where you start working and you realize, hang on, I can afford these things. Expenses cannot surpass income. That took me so long to understand. You want all these nice things, but you're not, saving. So I'm very comfortable right now financially. I'm really happy, and this is something that took me a while to get there, but we have to grow. At some stage, adulting is very hard.
It is. It's ridiculously hard. Yeah.
But that's not the advice I'm giving to young people, because adulting is already hard. But I think, there's a quote that I live by, and it's built on my grandfather's teachings, my mom's teachings, my brother's advice each time I meet him. It's embrace the individual you are, and don't be a follower that mankind conditions you to be.
Repeat that again, because that is deep.
Okay.
Embrace the
individual you are. Do not be a follower that mankind conditions you to be.
Wow.
Right? It means...
Drops mic. Anyway, continue.
This looks expensive. So
it is expensive.
For me, that basically means keep pushing, keep going. Being a good person, doing the right thing is so rewarding. But keep pushing, keep going. And that's all I have to say. Just keep embracing and entering in spaces as you are. And we talked about this before the podcast, that people love Basotho. People love who we are. We're literally one of the most unique human beings on the planet. Enter in those spaces. Don't shy. Don't look down on yourself. Don't nap on yourself.
On yourself. So many of us are napping on ourselves.
We stay. So that's literally it. And it's the only thing that's really kept me going, that finding purpose and letting purposes drive me. I'm operating in my gift right now.
Operating in your gift.
That's literally, you'll see the things the things that come to you when you operate in your gift.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow.
That's it.
And then in closing, if people want to connect with you, where do they find you? Obviously, I'll link all that in the description box below.
Hundreds.
But where do people find you? Platforms, socials, the whole shebang.
cool. Find Khansa before you find me.
Sure.
Khansa Energy, KHANTSA, Khansa, right? Khansa Energy, and on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Me, Kwaile_Mona on Instagram. I also just started Twitter. I know I'm really slow. Please don't come at me. I have like 2 followers on Twitter. So that's where you find us. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here, really privileged. You have an amazing team working with you, and I really, really feel grounded in the space. So thank you for making this possible.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. And you guys know the drill by now. This conversation cannot be shared enough. So do the right thing. Share it with your friends, your family, share it with the government, because I know the Prime Minister actually spoke about climate change as one of his key initiatives. So please share this video with as many people as possible so that we are enlightened. And so let's get that information and let's be enlightened. Climate change is a big issue. And as Basotho, as Africans, we need to do our part to educate and empower ourselves so that we are in those spaces with the right information. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, your family, your frenemies. We want them as well. And then, of course, leave a comment below and let us know, what do you actually know about climate change, especially in the Lesotho context. And until the next video, which he should be back for a part 2 of this conversation, love, peace, and money. Signing out. Cheers, guys.